June 16, 1943. Port Moresby is still dark, but the air is already warm and heavy, thick with fuel vapor, wet dust, and the faint sting of exhaust that never really leaves the field. On the hard ground of 7 Mile Drome, a B-17E sits under dim lamps like a ship waiting for tide. Its skin is scarred. Its belly is swollen with extra guns. The men around it move with practiced quiet. No speeches, no theatrics, just hands, checking latches, camera mounts, ammo feeds. Because today is not a bombing run. It's a mapping run. That's worse. A bomber can jink on the way to a target. A photographer can't. To draw the coastline clean, you fly straight and level, again and again, over places where the enemy watches the sky like fishermen watching water. As the engines catch and the night begins to thin, one aircraft lifts alone toward Bougainville, carrying a mission born from the wider pressure of a war that is turning into a fight for information itself. By mid-1943, the Pacific War had entered a new, colder phase. The chaos of first contact was over. The shock of Pearl Harbor had burned away. What replaced it was something slower and more exacting. A grinding contest for position, airfields, sea lanes, and islands whose names meant nothing to most of the world, but everything to the men ordered to take them. Guadalcanal was the turning point. When the campaign ended in February 1943, it did not deliver peace or momentum. It delivered clarity. Both sides now understood that victory in the Pacific would not come from single blows, but from methodical advance, one island, one runway, one anchorage at a time. And methodical warfare requires maps, not sketches, not guesswork. Precise photographic intelligence, coastlines measured in yards, reef depths traced by shadow, jungle clearings counted and catalogued. Amphibious landings lived or died on such details. A landing craft that grounded too early could stall an entire assault. A misjudged shoreline could turn infantry into targets before they ever fired a shot. For the Allies, this need fell heavily on aerial reconnaissance units operating from fragile footholds in New Guinea and Fletcher's airfields around Port Moresby. The Japanese still held much of the northern Solomons. Bougainville, large, mountainous, and heavily defended, sat directly astride the Allied advance toward Rabaul, the great Japanese bastion in the region. Rabaul itself was too strong to assault directly. The strategy was isolation. Cut it off, starve it of air cover and shipping. But isolation required surrounding positions, and Bougainville was one of the keys. This was where photomapping entered the war. Unlike traditional reconnaissance flights that could dart in, snap images, and turn away, mapping missions demanded discipline bordering on suicidal. Cameras had to overlap frames, altitude had to remain constant. Course deviations ruined entire runs. The aircraft became predictable, an unforgivable sin in hostile airspace. In Europe, these risks were shared by formations. In the Pacific, range and logistics often meant something worse. Single aircraft. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress was never designed for this role. It was built to survive by mutual defense, tight boxes of bombers, overlapping fields of fire, each aircraft protecting the other's blind spots. Alone, it was a contradiction, heavily armed, but isolated, durable, but exposed. Yet necessity overruled doctrine. At Port Moresby, the 43rd Bomb Group was already living in a world of improvisation. Aircraft were patched together from wrecks. Crews learned to fix engines in mud. Missions blurred lines between bomber, scout, and gunship. What mattered was whether the job got done and whether anyone came back. Some crews volunteered for these mapping missions. Others were assigned. Either way, the reality was understood. If intercepted, there would be no escort, no second chance, no friendly fighters sweeping in from above, just one aircraft, straight and level, and whatever rose to meet it. That reality pressed heavily on the men preparing for June 16th, not yet knowing how completely this mission would strip away assumptions on both sides of the sky. The aircraft chosen for the mission was not ordinary, even by the standards of Pacific improvisation. It was a Boeing B-17E, serial 41226666, already famous in its own small circle for looking less like a bomber and more like a weaponized repair job that had refused to die. The men who flew it called it Old 666. Its reputation came from what had been done to it, a deliberate attempt to solve a simple problem in the most brutal way possible. If you must fly alone, then you must make the lone aircraft harder to kill. Old 666 carried additional machine guns beyond standard configuration, added wherever there was space and structural tolerance, because the enemy's advantage in an interception is angles. Fighters live on angles. They are built for them. They approach from blind spots, from below, from oblique rear quarters, from places where a bomber's standard arcs of fire weaken or disappear. A lone aircraft can be pecked apart by disciplined attackers who cycle in and out of those gaps. So Old 606 was turned into a porcupine. More guns meant more coverage. More coverage meant fewer safe approaches. It did not make the aircraft invincible. Nothing in 1943 air combat was invincible. But it changed the math. It forced attacking pilots to accept greater risk per pass, and it rewarded gunners who could stay calm long enough to let the enemy come close. That was only part of the equation. The other part was the mission itself. On June 16, 1943, the target region was Bucha and the northern approaches of Bougainville, enemy territory where Japanese airfields and fighter units could react quickly. The job was photographic mapping, not a quick snapshot, but a line-by-line recording of coastline and terrain, frames overlapping, angles, controlled, altitudes held. A mapping run forces a bomber into a kind of rigidity that fighter pilots love. The aircraft must fly predictable tracks. It must hold speed. It must resist the instinct to jink when tracers rise. Over land, that predictability is dangerous. Over water, it becomes worse, because distance steals rescue. From Port Moresby, the flight meant long legs over empty ocean. If an engine failed, there might be no place to land. If the bomber ditched, survival depended on luck, currents, and whether anyone even knew where to search. And then, there was the Japanese side of the equation. By 1943, Japanese fighter pilots in the Northern Solomons were not ignorant amateurs. They were hardened by months of combat, defending critical positions against a growing Allied air presence. They understood interception. They understood that a lone bomber, especially one that must fly straight, was a gift. The scramble would not need perfect timing. It only needed enough aircraft, launched fast enough, to converge on a predictable line. And if the Americans were forced to fly that line to complete the mapping, then the Japanese could attack repeatedly, learning the bombers' arcs of fire as they went, adjusting their angles, rotating fresh pilots into the attack. It was an ambush built from geography and necessity. The Americans were sending one aircraft because the mission demanded it. The Japanese could concentrate fighters because the defense allowed it. Somewhere above the Solomon Sea, the two logics would meet. Old 666 climbed north, with its cameras secured, its extra guns loaded, and a crew that understood the odds in a calm, professional way, like men who have already accepted that fear won't change the distance to the target. And as the coastline of Bougainville began to rise from the horizon, the mission narrowed from strategy to minutes and seconds, setting the stage for the first angle, the human reality inside that aircraft, before the sky turned violent. A long-range mission does not begin with gunfire. It begins with silence. Hours into the flight, the crew's world shrinks to vibration, heat, and the constant, low-pressure awareness that there is no second aircraft nearby, no friendly formation, no casual radio chatter from escorts. The bomber is a small, noisy island moving through an ocean of air. In that environment, fear rarely arrives as panic. It arrives as focus. Men check the same things repeatedly, not because they've forgotten, but because repetition creates a thin layer of control over the uncontrollable. Camera settings, ammo feeds, oxygen lines, intercom clarity. The texture of the mission becomes mechanical on purpose. If you treat it like a ritual, you can keep the mind from racing ahead to the moment when the first fighter appears. And yet the emotional truth sits beneath the routine. A lone aircraft is personal. In a formation, danger feels shared. Alone, it feels direct, like the enemy is coming, for you specifically. Every creak of the airframe becomes a question. Every engine note becomes an omen. Men who have survived dozens of missions sometimes discover that what unsettles them most is not flak, but isolation. Inside Old 666, That isolation was met with a particular kind of Pacific War calm, hard-earned and unsentimental. Nobody believed in invulnerability. They believed in preparation, in discipline, in holding their sectors, in not wasting ammunition, in trusting the man next to them to do the same. The human angle of this mission is not bravado. It's endurance, the ability to sit in a vibrating metal shell, knowing you are flying into an interception zone and still perform the work that requires patience, level flight, steady course, camera run, again and again. Because a mapping mission doesn't ask for heroics at first. It asks you to stay straight when every instinct says, turn. A lone heavy bomber is not hunted the way a fighter is hunted. Fighters are killed quickly, often in a single mistake. Bombers are killed in layers. An interception begins far away with geometry. Fighters climb to meet the bomber's altitude, then position for the safest approach, usually from areas where the bomber's guns cover least effectively. Attacking pilots study arcs of fire like surgeons studying anatomy. They look for the blind seams below the tail, low front quarters, places where the bomber's structure blocks a gunner's view, or where a gun mount can't depress far enough. A standard B-17 defensive system is designed for formation overlap. Alone, it becomes a game of coverage gaps. The bomber's survival depends on whether its gunners can force attackers out of those seams by sheer threat, making every approach feel expensive. That is why attack patterns matter. A disciplined fighter unit does not simply charge, it cycles. One element attacks, while another repositions. The idea is not to win in one pass, but to wear the bomber down, damage the engines, shatter controls, injure gunners, start fires, create smoke, degrade the aircraft's ability to hold altitude and course. And for a mapping mission, degrading course holding is victory in itself. If the bomber cannot fly straight, the photography becomes useless. The enemy doesn't always need to destroy the aircraft. Sometimes it only needs to ruin the data. So the tactical battle is two simultaneous fights, survival and mission integrity. Old 606 would be forced to fight both. The B-17E was built around a concept: survive long enough to deliver bombs and defend itself through layered gun positions. But Old 666 was something else. An aircraft modified to make solitude less fatal. Extra machine guns changed the engagement in a very specific way. They didn't just add firepower, they changed confidence for the crew and against the enemy. A fighter pilot approaching a lone bomber is making a calculation. How close can I get before the gunfire becomes accurate? How long can I stay in the firing lane? How likely is a lucky hit on my engine or pilot? If you add guns and reduce the safe zones, you shorten the time a fighter can sit in the approach corridor. You force faster passes. Faster passes reduce aim time. Reduced aim time means fewer lethal hits on the bomber. This is not magic, it's probability. Field modifications also reflect a truth about the Pacific Air War. Distance punished perfection. Aircraft were repaired with what existed. Parts were cannibalized. Gun mounts were improvised. Crews became mechanics. Mechanics became engineers. Old 606 embodied that entire ecosystem. And yet technology has limits. More guns mean more weight. More weight strains engines. It can reduce climb rate and range, dangerous in a mission that already pushes distance. It can make an aircraft slower, and a slower bomber is a bomber that fighters can linger around. So Old 606's extra defenses came with a cost. They did not guarantee survival. They only ensured that if the Japanese came to kill a lone bomber easily, they would find something else waiting for them, an aircraft that could reach out farther than expected, and a crew trained to make every pass hurt. Which leads naturally to the next set of angles: leadership, enemy mindset, and the moral weight of a mission where information is paid for in blood. Leadership in the air rarely looks like a speech. It looks like a decision made early, before the first tracer, when the mission is still theoretical, and the risk is still a number on paper. For a mapping flight, the commander's burden is unusually sharp. A bomber pilot can usually choose aggression or evasion on approach and exit. A photo mapping pilot is trapped by his own objective. If he dodges too much, he may return alive with useless film. If he holds the line, he offers the enemy a steady target. Captain J. Zemer Jr. led a hand-picked crew because this mission demanded more than competence. It demanded men who could endure a long exposure to danger without breaking rhythm. gunners who would wait for the correct range, engineers who could keep an injured aircraft alive, and camera operators who could still think like technicians while the airframe was being hit. Zimmer's calm, described consistently in accounts of the mission, was functional. Calm is contagious in an aircraft. Panic spreads faster than smoke. A leader who communicates clearly, who assigns focus to each station, reduces fear to tasks. Hold your sector, clear the jam, report damage, keep the run. And once the engagement begins, leadership narrows further. It becomes triage. It becomes prioritizing engines over ego, altitude over anger, course over impulse. Because the decisive leadership test here is not only whether to fight, it is whether to keep flying straight. From the Japanese perspective, a lone heavy bomber was a specific kind of target. It was large, it was slower than a fighter, it could not turn sharply, and in a mapping profile, it would behave predictably, like an animal caught between hunger and fear. Japanese pilots in the Solomons had learned a harsh lesson since 1942. Air combat was becoming less romantic and more mathematical. The enemy was arriving with more aircraft, better logistics, and an industrial base that replaced losses quickly. That pressure encouraged efficiency. Interception doctrine, especially against bombers, rewarded pilots who attacked from safer angles, conserved energy, and avoided head-on bravery when methodical passes could do the job. So when a lone bomber appeared, there was every reason to believe it could be dismantled. The first approach is always a test. If the bomber's gunfire is light, attackers can close farther next time. If the gunners are inaccurate, pilots can linger longer. If the bomber begins evasive maneuvers, it often loses altitude or reveals predictable patterns. And then, old 666 answers that test differently. Extra guns mean the first pass is punished. Tight discipline means the gunners don't waste rounds at impossible distances. When a fighter pilot expects a bomber to flinch and instead meets a wall of fire, the psychology shifts. Mockery turns into caution. Caution, in turn, becomes frustration. Because frustration tempts pilots into riskier approaches, and riskier approaches are where aces begin to fall one by one. The bomber does not need to outfly them. It only needs to force them to keep paying for each attack until the cost is too high. Mapping missions reveal an uncomfortable truth about modern war. Sometimes the most valuable weapon is not a bomb, but a photograph. Aerial imagery turns terrain into planning. It turns reefs into routes. It turns a coastline into a schedule for landing craft. It allows commanders to commit men to a beach with fewer unknowns. It can shorten battles, sometimes by days, sometimes by weeks. But those advantages are purchased in a quiet currency. Small crews sent to do dangerous work that cannot be shared widely. A bomber raid might involve dozens of aircraft, spreading risk across hundreds of men. A lone mapping mission concentrates risk into one fuselage. It is efficient for the war machine and intimate for the crew. If they fail, the operation may be delayed or blunder forward blind. If they succeed, others may land on a shore with better odds. This is why the emotional weight of the old 666 mission is heavier than the usual bomber story. The film is not just of combat, but of obligation, of men asked to fly straight through the place where enemy fighters live, because the next stage of the war depends on what their cameras bring back. And that strategic logic leads directly to the moment when theory ends. Because somewhere ahead, over Bougainville's northern approaches, the intercept is already forming, engines climbing, fighters aligning for their first pass, while old 666 holds its course, committing to the line that will either become a map or a grave. The sun is not fully up when the Solomon Sea begins to brighten beneath the bomber's wings, an uneven sheen of pale light broken by cloud shadow and long swells. Old 606 is alone out there, running north from Port Moresby on a mission planned for the kind of war that happens before the shooting starts. Cameras, measurements, coastline geometry. In preparation for amphibious operations, the crew has been sent roughly 600 miles unescorted to photograph Buka and the northern approaches of Bougainville. Inside a heavy bomber at altitude, time stretches. Engine noise becomes constant. The air is cold enough to numb exposed skin, but the stations are cramped, and the tension makes men sweat inside their flight gear anyway. The work is technical. The stakes are not. Then land appears, dark green mass rising from the ocean, edged by reefs and white surf. It's beautiful in the way enemy territory can be beautiful, calm from a distance, lethal up close. As Old 606 passes over Buka, the event that will define the mission begins not with gunfire, but with movement on the ground. About 20 Japanese fighters lift off to intercept the lone aircraft. It's a moment that changes the entire temperature of the flight. A lone bomber can sometimes slip through if the enemy is slow, distracted, or poorly positioned. But here the reaction is immediate, organized, confident, and confidence makes sense. A single bomber is a clear problem with a clear solution. Fighters can choose altitude, angle, and timing. They can attack in turns, learn the bomber's arcs of fire, punish weak spots, and keep returning until engines fail or control surfaces tear away. Against a bomber that must fly straight for photography, the advantage becomes sharper still. This is the point where doctrine and survival collide. The mission's purpose is not to visit Bougainville. It is to map it. That means the aircraft must commit to a plotted line, long enough to capture overlapping images, steady enough to preserve detail. It cannot simply dive away at the first sign of danger and still return with something useful. Old 686 continues. The decision is not reckless in the way movies portray recklessness. It is professional and therefore colder. The crew is there because someone needs those photographs. If the aircraft turns away now, the flight becomes a wasted risk. If it presses on, the risk becomes concentrated, immediate, and unavoidable. The bomber moves south toward the mapping run. The coastline begins to unfurl beneath them. Jungle ridges, river mouths, beaches that look empty from altitude but are never truly empty in war. Up above and behind, fighters are climbing. Interceptions are rarely sudden. They are assembled. The enemy must gather speed and altitude, then translate that energy into positioning. A heavy bomber is faster than it appears from the ground, and a fighter that arrives too low or too slow cannot attack safely. It will be forced into a long, exposed climb through the bomber's gun arcs. So there is a waiting period, tense and silent, where the crew knows what is coming, but cannot yet see it clearly. Gunners scan. Eyes move constantly between sky and horizon. Each station becomes its own narrow universe of glass, metal framing, and blue. And then the first shapes form, small, dark specks that grow rapidly as they close. The initial passes are the enemy's reconnaissance in miniature. A fighter pilot tests range, tests the bomber's reaction, tests whether the gunners fire too early, wasting ammunition and revealing their patterns, or whether they hold until the target is close enough that every burst matters. Old 606 answers with something the Japanese pilots are not expecting from a lone aircraft. It is not just a bomber with guns. It is a bomber built around guns, a salvaged B-17E refitted with a striking number of additional machine guns by a crew known for volunteering for extreme missions. In the thin air above Bougainville, that difference becomes visible in the fighter's behavior. Attack runs shorten, approaches become sharper, less leisurely. Pilots cannot linger where they want to linger. They must commit faster or break off. The mapping run begins, and that is when the trap fully closes. Now, Old 666 must do the one thing that feels most unnatural under attack. It must remain steady. The aircraft holds course because the cameras demand it. Each second on the plotted line is a second offered to the enemy. Fighters begin coordinating more aggressively. Some come in from the front, where closing speed is violent and the firing window is brief. Others seek oblique angles, trying to rake the cockpit, the engines, the control surfaces, anything that will make straight and level physically impossible. Inside the bomber, the battle becomes a series of mechanical crises layered over human ones. Vibrations change as hits land. The smell of cordite grows. Metal fragments cut into the airframe. Men are wounded and must keep working anyway, because there is no spare crew on a lone aircraft. No redundancy, no one to rotate into a blood-soaked position. And still the bomber stays on its line because the mission is nearly completed, and because the crew understands something that is easy to forget from the ground. If they break now, they will have endured the worst of it for nothing. The fighters keep coming. Their early confidence is still there, but it is being eroded pass by pass, because a lone bomber that refuses to break turns every attack into a gamble. And gambling is how experienced pilots, aces included, start to vanish from the sky one at a time. Ahead, the combat is about to compress into its most brutal form. Coordinated frontal attacks, close-range gunfire, and the moment when one station in the aircraft, the nose, becomes the hinge on which the entire mission will turn. By the time the mapping run reaches its final leg, the engagement has settled into a brutal rhythm. The Japanese fighters no longer attack experimentally. They attack with urgency. They come in coordinated waves, diving from altitude to convert height into speed, then pulling through the bomber's firing arcs in seconds. Some try head-on passes, violent compressed moments where closing speed leaves no room for hesitation. Others rake along the flanks, aiming for engines, radio compartment, cockpit glass, anything that might end the mission without needing to destroy the aircraft outright. Inside old 666, the aircraft is no longer whole. Control cables are damaged, engines are hit, the fuselage is torn open in places where light should not exist. Blood mixes with oil and hydraulic fluid on the deck. Intercom calls are clipped and urgent now, not panicked, but stripped to essentials. And still the bomber flies straight. At the nose, Second Lieutenant Joseph Sarnowski mans the forward guns, one of the most exposed positions on the aircraft. The nose offers visibility and firepower, but little protection. Incoming fighters aiming head-on concentrate their fire there because it is where the bomber cannot dodge and where damage is most likely to disrupt control. Sarnowski's role is not cinematic in the way fiction portrays it. He does not spray wildly. He waits. He tracks. He fires when the fighter fills his sight picture, close enough that the return fire feels personal. This discipline matters. Fighters that might otherwise slip through the approach corridor are forced to break earlier or risk catastrophic hits. Several attackers do not break in time. They fall away damaged or destroyed, some trailing smoke, others simply vanishing downward into jungle and sea. The effect on the attackers is cumulative. What began as confident interception turns into attrition. Each pass costs more than expected. Each pilot must decide whether to press closer or accept that the bomber's defenses are not weakening as quickly as doctrine predicts. But the cost inside old 666 is rising too. Sarnowski is mortally wounded at his station, hit during one of the frontal attacks. Even then, accounts describe him continuing to fire until physically unable to do so. He does not leave his post. There is nowhere to retreat to, and no replacement for a forward gunner in a lone aircraft. His death marks the emotional center of the battle, not because the crew pauses, but because they cannot afford to. The mission has passed, the point where grief can exist in real time. It will arrive later, on the ground, if they reach it. Captain J. Zemer Jr. is badly wounded as well. Multiple injuries that would normally remove a pilot from control. But the aircraft cannot spare him. He remains at the controls, fighting shock and pain to keep old 666 flying because there is no alternative. This is the turning point. Not a single explosion, not a dramatic maneuver, but the moment when the Japanese attacks begin to thin, not because the bomber is invulnerable, but because the attackers are paying too high a price to continue in the same way. Fighters that remain begin to probe more cautiously. Their passes grow less coordinated. The bomber's fire has taught them respect, and respect steals momentum. And momentum is everything in an interception. The mapping run is complete. The cameras have done their work. The coastline is captured frame by frame. The information that justified the mission now exists on film, secured in the battered fuselage of a bomber that has no business still flying. What remains is escape. Old 666 turns away from Bougainville and begins the long withdrawal southward over open water. Still under threat, still damaged, but no longer constrained to straight and level flight. The fighters pursue for a time, but the engagement has changed. The bomber is no longer predictable. Fuel, damage, and losses begin to dictate choices on the Japanese side. Eventually, the sky grows quieter. Silence after combat is never peaceful. It is disorienting. The crew takes inventory, not of victories, but of survival. Who is alive? Who is wounded? What systems still respond? Which engines can be trusted? The bomber limps onward, heavy with damage and loss, carrying film that will help shape future operations, paid for by a crew that has just endured one of the most intense single aircraft engagements of the Pacific Air War. Ahead lies the hardest part psychologically, returning to friendly territory without knowing whether the aircraft will hold together long enough to reach it. And behind them, scattered across sea and jungle, are the wrecks of fighters whose pilots expected an easy kill from a lone American bomber, and instead found a machine and a crew that refused to break. That realization on both sides marks the true end of the battle. But the consequences, official, human, and strategic, are only beginning. When old 666 finally comes back within reach of friendly territory, the war does not end. It just changes temperature. From the outside, the aircraft arrives like a ghost, ragged, holed, and moving with the stubbornness of machinery that should have failed hours ago. The landing is not a triumphal moment. It is a collapse that has been delayed by discipline. On the ground at Port Moresby, men run toward the bomber expecting damage. They still underestimate it. The airframe carries the evidence of repeated attack runs, punctures clustered in patterns where fighters tried to find seams, tears where metal has been peeled back by impact, sections blackened or streaked by oil and smoke. The aircraft's survival feels less like protection and more like endurance, an object that has absorbed violence long enough to deliver what it carried. Then the crew begins to emerge. This is where the true cost becomes visible. There are wounded, seriously wounded, men who have been sitting with their injuries through hours of flight because there was nowhere else to go. The dead remain inside until they can be removed. Stations that had been filled with voices are now silent. Among the losses is 2nd Lieutenant Joseph Sarnowski, killed at the nose guns during the interception. His position, forward and exposed, had been central to beating back frontal passes. When he died, it was not only a personal loss. It was the loss of one of the aircraft's most decisive defensive points. Captain J. Zemer Jr. is brought out wounded, badly enough that in any normal circumstance, he would not have remained at the controls. Yet he did because the aircraft could not spare its pilot. In the hours that follow, the mission is reconstructed from fragments. Crew testimony, aircraft damage, and the film that proves the objective was completed. This is how the Pacific War turns combat into record, how violence becomes paperwork, and paperwork becomes history. The outcomes of the mission were soon recognized as extraordinary. Zemer received the Medal of Honor, as did Sarnowski, posthumously, a rare pairing that underlines how singular the engagement was. But medals do not explain the deeper meaning of what happened over Bougainville. They mark it. Because what old 666 demonstrated was not simply bravery under fire. It demonstrated that a lone aircraft, if modified and crewed for a specific kind of fight, could endure an interception that doctrine would normally consider fatal. It demonstrated that extra guns and disciplined gunnery could turn enemy confidence into hesitation, and hesitation into loss. Still, the aftermath is never only about what worked. It is also about what was paid. Sarnowski's death sits at the center of that payment, and around it are the injuries, trauma, and the thin line between return and disappearance over water. The bomber's survival becomes a story told to others on the airfield, but the men who lived it carry something quieter, the memory of a sky full of attackers, and the knowledge that the only reason the mission succeeded was because they kept flying straight when every instinct demanded escape. And beyond the airfield, the film they carried begins its own journey. Developed, analyzed, transformed into maps and planning documents that will shape where men land next and how many of them will live. That is the immediate aftermath: survival, loss, recognition. The longer aftermath, strategic and psychological, spreads outward from this single flight, changing how both sides think about lone aircraft, defensive fire, and the price of reconnaissance in the Pacific. In war, most events dissolve into the noise of everything else. But occasionally a single mission carries a strange weight, not because it changes the entire conflict overnight, but because it changes what people believe is possible. Old 666 did that. The most immediate consequence was practical. The photographic work mattered. Mapping runs were flown because commanders needed coastline detail and terrain intelligence for operations that were already being planned. Film brought back from hostile space did not stay film for long. It became measured imagery, annotated frames, and updated charts, tools that reduced uncertainty for later strikes and landings. That is the cold strategic truth. information shortens decision time. It reduces the number of unknowns that kill men before they even reach a beach. But the mission's influence extended beyond intelligence. It touched doctrine. Quietly, informally, in conversations among crews and maintenance men. A lone bomber surviving a heavy interception did not mean the risk was suddenly acceptable. It meant crews understood more clearly what kind of preparation mattered. It reinforced that defensive success was not only about courage, it was about coverage, about fields of fire, about gunners who held discipline long enough to make their bursts count, about modifications that reduced the enemy's safe approaches, at least enough to make an attack costly. In other words, Old 666 didn't make the solitary mission safe. It made it less predictable, and unpredictability is a weapon in air combat. On the Japanese side, the effect was different, more psychological than doctrinal, but no less real. Fighter pilots are trained to believe in advantage. They survive by trusting certain truths, that speed is life, that angle is control, that a lone bomber can be dismantled with coordinated passes if you remain disciplined. A bomber that refuses to break can poison those truths, because every time a fighter pilot loses a comrade to defensive fire, the brain revises risk. Every time an approach corridor proves more lethal than expected, confidence turns into caution. And caution, in a sustained interception, creates hesitation, fractional delays that widen spacing, disrupt timing, and weaken the collective pressure needed to finish the target. This is how aces fall one by one in real war, not always through dramatic duels, but through accumulated risk. A pilot presses an approach because he believes the bomber is near collapse. Another follows because he refuses to let the first claim the kill. A third comes in too close because the rhythm of repeated attacks breeds impatience. In that impatience, the bomber's gunners find what they need, a steady closing target inside effective range. Old 606's engagement demonstrated that defensive fire, properly concentrated, could turn repeated attack runs into a lottery where experience did not guarantee survival. And the aftermath carries another truth, one that sits underneath medals and mission reports. Reconnaissance is often remembered as the clean side of war, cameras, intelligence, planning. But on June 16, 1943, it was shown as something else. Direct combat without the purpose of destruction. A mission fought not to kill, but to see. That difference matters, because it reveals how modern war uses human bodies to acquire knowledge. It shows that information is not abstract. It is purchased by small crews sent into the exact place where the enemy has the clearest advantage. Old 666 returned with its film, and the mission became legend, recorded, awarded, retold, because it condensed so much of the Pacific Air War into one flight. Range, isolation, improvisation, and violence at close distance. And yet the final meaning of the mission does not sit on the airfield, or in the award citations, or even in the maps drawn from the images. It sits in the quiet space afterward, when men who survived an emptying sky realize that survival is not the same thing as being untouched, because the war goes on. The next missions still lift off, the next coastlines still need photographing, the next crews still climb into aircraft, with the knowledge that sometimes the most dangerous job is not dropping bombs, but flying straight long enough to bring back the truth. War is often remembered through explosions, through cities burning, ships sinking, and formations colliding in the sky. But beneath that violence is a quieter engine, information, moving the war forward, inch by inch, image by image, decision by decision. On June 16, 1943, over Bougainville, that engine took human form inside a single aircraft. Old 606 did not change the outcome of the Pacific War by itself. It did something more subtle. It revealed the cost of seeing clearly. It showed that knowledge is not gathered from a safe distance, but wrestled from places where the enemy holds every advantage. It showed that courage in modern war is often not a charge or a dive, but the ability to remain steady when survival depends on movement. The Japanese pilots who rose to meet the lone bomber expected doctrine to hold. They expected geometry and numbers to decide the fight. What they encountered instead was endurance, an aircraft reshaped by necessity, and a crew disciplined enough to deny easy solutions. For the Americans who flew that mission, victory did not arrive as celebration. It arrived as exhaustion, loss, and a long silence after the engine shut down. Medals would come later. History would assign meaning later. In the moment, there was only the weight of what had been paid, and the knowledge that others would now walk onto beaches with better maps because of it. That is the legacy of Old 666. Not invincibility, not legend, but proof that in a war measured by distance and attrition, a small group of people, flying alone, outnumbered and exposed, could still bend the odds long enough to bring back the truth. And sometimes, in war, that is enough.